Welcome to Autumn on the Grit. My name's Dean Parkin, and I'll be your guide for the next half hour as we look back on the vibrant years of Lowestoft's long-lost fishing village, once the most easterly community in the country. The village, which was known as a Grit, is sadly no more. After years of decline, it was demolished in the late 1960s. But in the first half of the 20th century, the Grit would come to life every autumn for the herring fishing season. For the rest of the year, the Grit was home to 2,500 people, churches, shops, 3 schools and 13 pubs. But every autumn its population doubled with the arrival of the Scots fishing fleet and fisher girls. It must have been like a huge festival of fish taking over the town. I've learnt quite a bit about this subject because in 1997 I published a book called The Grit, which I co-wrote with my friend and Lowestoft legend Jack Rose. Jack was a longshoreman, trawlerman, drifterman, lifeboatman, and came from a family who lived on the Grit for generations. He also published 11 local history books about his hometown, and the Grit was always his favourite. As I said, the book came out in autumn 1997, and here's Jack and me, well mainly Jack, talking on BBC Radio Norfolk and explaining a few basic Grit facts to presenter Tony Mallion.
For the people who don't know, we ought to explain that it's the area now which is largely occupied by the Birdseye factory.
Yeah, well, the beach village, I was going to come to that, Tony, was stretched from, say, the fish market, Hampton Road, right through to the Sparrow's Nest. It was about a mile long and about half a mile wide. And down there was all the fishing folk, or most of the fishing folks. And they intermarried and all this sort of thing, as you've no doubt you read in the book where they intermarried. You come up the beach for nothing. You were down there and you were a compact community, and that's how they were clannish. You could have a row of houses and they were all relatives.
What about this name? I mean, who said it was the Grit?
No, well, people have said that for years. They used to call them the Grit, you know.
They also know it as a beach as well,
yeah,
didn't
the
they?
beach, yeah. But mostly the Grit, because Sanders Grit and Sanders the beach. And they used to say the Grit. All the old people used to say the Grit. Humsey Norman and all them didn't do any.
And also it's got the connotations with, true grit.
True Grit, yes, that's what I liked about it as well.
The book was a local bestseller, and after years of being out of print, I revised and published a new expanded edition in 2019. I discovered more stories and found fresh photographs and commissioned new illustrations from Lowestoft artist Paula White, like this one, which appears on the cover of the new edition. Every one of the 13 chapters now has its own Paula White illustration, and her pictures really do bring the old place to life. Paula captures the days when Lowestoft was one of the premier herring ports in the country, and October 1913 marked the very height of that industry. Lowestoft's Great Fishing Bonanza! On the 12th of October 1913, 10 million herring were caught. One boat, the Boy Roy, netted £3,240. In today's money, that's £340,000 in one day made by one boat at Lowestoft in 1913. There were 770 vessels, 350 local, 420 Scottish, each with a crew of 10. That's nearly 8,000 fishermen landing in Lowestoft in 1913. 87% of the catch was exported to Germany and Russia. That's 466 million herring. More fish than the population of America. landed at Lowestoft in 1913. And that explains overfishing. And the German and Russian exports stopped after the First World War. And that's why we were so hard up in the 20s and 30s. But who can forget the great fishing bonanza in Lowestoft in 1913? You'd know it was autumn on the Grit, because that's when huge stacks of barrels would arrive on the pickling plots, where the fisher girls worked, gutting and packing the herring, ready for national distribution and export. From the mid-1920s, the pickling plots could be found here, on Hamilton Road, near to Hamilton Dock, where the drifters landed the herring. Locals will recognise Hamilton House top left, now of course home to Lowestoft Town Council. When we did the book in the 1990s, many former residents of the Grit shared their memories about the Scots fisher girls.
Here's Ruby Timberley.
Every September, prior to the herring season, they'd arrive at lodgings which had already been arranged for them by the firm they worked for. The girls duly arrived with their large wooden boxes, with all they would need whilst away from home. These girls, as we called them, though some were middle-aged, worked very hard in bitter weather, early and late. It gave the people who took them into their homes a few pounds to help stock up with coal or buy children some clothes for the winter. These Scots girls were a jolly lot. They didn't work on Sundays though, but went to church or chapel. If during the week, owing to the weather, there was no fish for a couple of hours, they weren't idle, but got out the jerseys they were knitting for their menfolk. The Scots girls had a canteen hut built on the pickling plots, where Eric Horn's mother had a job, cooking and cleaning. He remembered. On Saturdays and other times they helped out by collecting their dirty cups and became known by the girls as the Wee Bairn. For lunch they ate Scotch broth, which my mother prepared, on a huge cooking range which had to be hot first thing in the morning. The eating area was kept warm by an old tortoise combustion stove. The girls loved their jam doughnuts and ice buns, which were delivered in great long trays from the local bakery.
Leonard Boyce, who lived with his grandparents at the East of England Tavern, one of the 13 pubs on the Grit, remembered the Scots girls.
When the fisher girls were doing their gutting, they used these old acetylene lamps or flares, and the whole area was full of smoke. But how those women worked in the weather they did, the snow even, they'd still be gutting herring. These old horse-drawn carts used to come with loads of fish, which were tipped in the troughs, and as fast as they could gut 'em, so they'd fill 'em up. That was remarkable. They always had bandages on every finger to protect themselves instead of gloves. They had come from the other side of the road, where they'd been gutting, with these great heavy boots on, all skins down to their ankles, and no matter how cold or wet it was, they'd take all their fish gear off outside, put it in the shed, and then come in, go straight through to their room. We had the same 4 girls for about 3 years. They came in October and went home just before Christmas.
We can actually see the fisher girls at work in Lowestoft in this 1938 documentary, complete with priceless and very outdated commentary.
This view gives an impressive idea of the scope of the herring industry at the port of Lowestoft. These barrels contain herrings by the 100,000, salted and packed, ready bloated, kippered or pickled for the waiting millions of home consumers. While we're on the spot, let us take a closer look at what happens from the time the herrings leave the drifters. Along these bays are ranged the squads of Scotch girls who clean and pack the herrings. They move up and down the coast with the herring shoals and are always on hand where the herrings are being caught in the greatest numbers. As fast as the men empty their tubs of fish into the bins, the girls clean and sort the herrings. Their speed and accuracy is astonishing. A single movement removes the gut from the fish, which is instantly dropped back to one of 5 baskets. A glance behind them, the girls drop the herrings into the bucket. Watch them. Behind the line of workers moves a man to check that the sorting is correctly done. But although he's continually checking up the fish in the baskets according to the 5 standard sizes, it's a rare occurrence for him to find a single mistake. The tubs of herrings, cleaned and sorted, are carried over to the packers. Packing the herrings into barrels should be a good exercise for slimming. There's always the risk of getting stuck head first in the barrel with your face on the fish. These Scotch girls who work ashore in the herring industry have a pretty tough job to handle. Out in all weathers, handling wet fish in an icy wind, on their feet all the time, carrying heavy loads wouldn't suit everyone. But they're healthy and cheerful, and some of them are real good lookers. Many of them have spent the whole of their working lives at this job and make good money during the season. When the day's work's done, a good clean-up with hot water and carbolic soap leaves them neat and fresh for the evening.
A good home fishing season was good news for the local shops and businesses, which included the 13 pubs on the Grit. The Suffolk Fishery Tavern was in Anguish Street, and in the 1920s belonged to the Norman family. Bob Norman, known locally as Umshie Norman, was quoted in the Eastern Evening News in September 1966. He said, "Each crew used to have 2 gallons of beer and bread and cheese for fitting out. Now I used to take it down to the butts with a nanny goat and cart. Then there was a hot stout to be taken over, day and night, to the women working in the smokehouses." Umshie's brother, Lenny, recalled how pub business started bright and early in the autumn. He said, "They used to open up at 5 o'clock in the morning for the drivers of the carts and for rum and beverages, right through to breakfast for the herring workers. In the pub, we had a snug. When all their husbands had gone to work, the women used to come in there with a jug and fill it up with beer to take home."
George Nicholson, known as Bloater, and his wife Jessie, took over the Rising Sun in 1955.
His daughter, Edna, had vivid memories of the pub in autumn. She said, "Dad used to let all the Scottish fishermen in on Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock. You weren't supposed to, but they all used the back gate. And the bar was quite full by 10:30 a.m. They all liked the whiskey. In October and November, all the smokehouses round there used to smell of kipper smoke. I thought it was lovely." Bloater Nicholson ran the Rising Sun for nearly 12 years before he retired in September 1966. The Gashouse Tavern had only just closed, and Bloater talked to the East of Evening News about the decline of the grit. He said, "There are no locals left now. It's all parson trade. People working down here, lorry drivers and that sort. I'll be glad when the area gets cleaned up. You get all sorts in the empty houses, old ones and youngsters. No one knows what they get up to."
The clearance of the grit really gathered pace by 1967. On bonfire night that year, local children had rich pickings from the latest buildings to fall. Where the children are standing was once the Gashouse Tavern and Cumberland Square, and in the background you can see the old North Beach Bethel, ready for demolition. Jack Rose always did say that the old cottages and fish houses on the grit could have been such a big tourist attraction. And in the mid-1960s, the East Suffolk Planning Act said that some of the cottages in the fishing village should be preserved. And even when they were clearing it, there were rumours that maybe the Rising Sun might be saved or even rebuilt once the road had been widened. But that autumn, in 1967, the end of the grit was in sight. What if they had kept those 5 cottages in Cumberland Square? They were good examples of cobbled houses built using stones from the beach. And while we're at it, they could have kept those 2 cottages on the right, Sadie Villa and Derby Villa. And the Gashouse Tavern too. The old primitive Methodist chapel was demolished early in the new year, 1968. Built in 1863, it hadn't been used as a chapel since 1876. It could have been converted into anything. It had already been a soup kitchen in World War I, and it was used as a sanitation store by Birdseye in the 1950s. That chapel would have made a great arts centre or music venue. And while they're at it, at the very least, they should have left the almshouses. So many people wish they hadn't pulled those down in February 1968. They could have been done up so nicely. So it's interesting to see this photograph from 1950, looking south down Wapload Road, Rantscore on the right, the old Eagle Brewery to the right of the score, and in the distance, on the left, is Squire's shop. Now this is the same view in 1960, and you can see the area is already starting to be cleaned up and transformed into a new industrial estate, led by Birdseye, who had built all the new buildings on the right. Birdseye had arrived in Lowestoft in 1949. It was very small scale then. It began to grow across the old village, and the more the herring industry declined, it seemed the more Birdseye took over and, of course, created jobs. In fact, in the autumn 1960, Prince Philip visited the town to see the ever-expanding Birdseye factory.
Maybe not since King George II came ashore in 1737 has there been a royal visit on the grit. That's certainly one for the family album. But the Duke of Edinburgh was warmly welcomed to the all-new Birdseye factory in Lowestoft and shown the modern ways of food processing. The good news is, kippers are still being filleted the traditional way. as is this strange kettle of fish. But with Christmas just round the corner, sprouts are already being cleaned, graded and packed, all using the latest modern technology. Even when there's a right royal visitor, there's no time to stand and talk on this job. Having wisely brought his duffel coat, the Duke was shown around Birdseye's new cold store, built to house 20,000 tons of fish. Better not tell the Duke, but round here, the fish finger is king.
In 2019, Birdseye celebrated the 70th anniversary of its arrival in Lowestoft, and now has a state-of-the-art modern food plant. In the very place where nearly 8,000 fishermen caught 10 million herring on one day in October 1913, and all those fisher girls gutted and packed the fish to be exported to Germany and Russia. Today, over a century later, just a few workers on the same site produce 1 million waffles every 24 hours to be sent all over the world. And of course, people no longer have to live right next door to where they work. Although the Grit has always been surrounded by industry, it's also always been a home for leisure activities. There's still a caravan site and sparrow's nest gardens near the Birdseye factory. And at one time the North Beach, right next to the Grit, was as popular as the South Beach, and was certainly the playground for the children of the village. But we are talking about the autumn here, so the summer is over. But in the early 1920s, a new sea wall was built right next to the Grit, which was wide enough for cars and tourist buses. And in September 1927 was the venue for car and motorbike races. Imagine that. Well, I've come across some footage recorded on someone's cine camera that very day over 90 years ago of those races. A magnificent cup was donated by the town council, and a crowd estimated at 6,000 by the Lowestoft Journal saw cars and motorcycles hurtling along the sea wall. On the mile-long course, it was said that one car reached 100 miles per hour. Now don't forget, this was in the days when lorry drivers were fined for exceeding the 12 miles per hour speed limit in the town. So 100 miles per hour was the sort of speed you could only dream of. And here it was, on the Grit, in front of your very eyes. Autumn always came too soon for the children on the Grit. Some had spent the summer down on the harbour beach, borrowing one of the rafts used to paint the boats. Others had played around the boat sheds or on the pickling plots, or were given a bottle of water and bread and lard sandwiches and told to stay out all day. But now summer was over, and September meant back to school. Here is Miss Hardingham's class at Mariners Score School in 1931. This was one of 3 schools on the Grit in the early 20th century. Here it is. Doesn't look very inviting, does it? So this was built in 1846 for 182 children. Doesn't look big enough, does it? And it went through various name changes until it became known as Mariners Score School in the early 1900s. Although it closed as a school in 1934, the building was still standing in the 1960s, when of course it was used by Birdseye, as their laundry store. Back in the day, though, in the late 1920s, Ruby Timberley, who we heard from earlier about the Fisher Girls, went to school in Mariners School. She said, "My brother, sister and myself, we all went there. We had teachers who were strict, kind and dedicated. We could all read and write by the age of 6 and could repeat most of the tables." Ron James, who would later run the Comfy Cafe on the Grit, also went to school there. He remembered Miss Strickland. She was the headmistress, and weren't she suffin' strict? On our way to school, we'd run and kick the herring barrels, so the brine would go all over the boy running behind us. And after that, if you got to school at Mariners School, sat near the stoves and got hot, you'd really stink of fish. And Miss Strickland would come along and she used to clip you across the lug and tell you to go home and change. Of course, you had nothing to change into. In those days, there was no Ofsted for schools to worry about, but they did have to contend with the Borough of Lowestoft Education Committee Annual Report. And back in 1908, Mariners School certainly got some criticism. The report says, all desks are old-fashioned, without backs, and are nearly 50 to 60 years old. There are no windows in the north end of school. There is a small unpaved playground for boys, but none for girls. The latter play on the pickling plots on the Deans. The report also records the children's illnesses. It says that in 1908, 86% of the children have suffered from measles, 50% from whooping cough, 21% from chickenpox, and smaller numbers for scarlet fever and diphtheria. 15% have not been vaccinated. Conditions at the school didn't really improve much by the 1920s. But despite that, Ruby Timberley remembered her school days fondly. She said, "At the age of 8 years, we moved to other schools. But I remember we had prayers at the beginning of the day and before we went home in the afternoon. We also sang the hymn, 'Now the day is over.' But we had a good grounding." So that was Autumn on the Grit, and thank you for watching. Please do share any thoughts and memories about the old place in the comments section. But the final word has to go to my old governor, Jack Rose. Now, at the end of the Radio Norfolk interview in 1997, Tony Mallion asked Jack to read The Beach Boys' Lament, a poem that Jack had written for the book, all about his childhood around the fishing village. It seems like a good place for us to end Autumn on the Grit.
Jack, I wonder, would you read just the first bit of your... Come on, I knew you were going to ask me.
No, I read this out on Radio Suffolk, not being nasty.
Yeah, well, we're not listening to Radio Suffolk, we're listening to Radio Norfolk, go on.
A Beach Boys' Lament. Now, this explained it to you all in verse.
Mm-hmm.
When we were a lot younger, we knew starvation and hunger. We were all poor, yes, down and out. If we were naughty, we got a good clout. Mum was bossed whilst Dad was at sea. Condensed milk sandwiches with sugar for tea. We went to the baker's and asked for stale buns, and off to the butcher's for bones we did run. A Sunday dinner we seldom had. Times, I'm afraid, were hard and very bad. Second-hand clothes were what we wore. These had to last as we got no more. holes in our shoes and down to the uppers. We never worried about any suppers. Down to the market for an old cod's head. This would be mixed with a swede and some bread. Everything was asked for in hope of a meal. We were told always ask, never steal.
Oh, beautiful stuff. That sums it up all, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's
Very-
another verse explaining more of the games and that we used to play.
Well, if people want to find out about that, then they can buy the book, can't they? It's called The Grit. It's the story of Lowestoft's beach village. It's full of the most lovely photographs that bring it all back. And you've done a marvellous job to record that history for us for generations to come.
Thank you.
We were so poor, Tony, that when the vandals broke in, they tidied up for us.